No one noticed the exact moment when power began to shift. There was no announcement. No emergency meeting. No breaking news alert. The world continued as usual, unaware that something long buried had started to breathe again. In the heart of the capital, inside a building designed to project permanence and control, a powerful minister sat behind his desk with the ease of a man who had not been surprised in years. His office was quiet, protected by layers of protocol and loyalty. Every object inside it spoke the language of authority: thick folders, muted colors, framed photographs of diplomatic handshakes meant to signal legitimacy. He had earned this position, or at least that was the story repeated often enough to become accepted truth. For over a decade, his name had been associated with stability. International partners trusted him. Domestic institutions deferred to him. His approval could accelerate projects or quietly suffocate them. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Power, when fully matured, does not shout. It expects obedience. And it usually receives it. Years earlier, however, long before the cameras and carefully scripted speeches, a decision had been made in a closed room. It was not illegal in the way scandals often are. It was worse. It was engineered. Structured to appear compliant while quietly transferring wealth, influence, and leverage into private channels. A deal that benefited a select few while extracting a long-term cost from the many. The minister had not been reckless. Every step was calculated. Documents were signed under neutral titles. Funds moved through trusted intermediaries. Oversight committees were satisfied with partial explanations. The system absorbed the transaction like it always did, and when questions eventually surfaced, as they always do, the responses were ready. A report here. A revised figure there. A witness who suddenly remembered events differently. Time did the rest. The minister watched as the controversy faded, replaced by newer crises and louder scandals. Attention moved on. Careers continued. Promotions followed. What once carried the potential to destroy him slowly transformed into something distant and harmless. A closed chapter. Or so he believed. What men like him often misunderstand is the nature of erasure. Destruction removes evidence. Erasure requires something more difficult: absolute control over memory. Over systems. Over people. And absolute control is an illusion. Far from the capital's protected corridors, Ibrahim Traoré understood this better than most. He did not hunt scandals. He did not chase rumors. He studied behavior. While others reacted to events, Traoré watched what happened when nothing seemed to be happening. He paid attention to patterns. Who avoided which questions, which names never appeared in official summaries, which projects were always rushed through without discussion. Power leaves traces. Not always in documents, but in habits. Traoré spoke little in public during this time. Silence was mistaken for distance. In reality, it was discipline. He listened during meetings, allowing others to talk themselves into revealing priorities. He observed who felt comfortable interrupting and who grew cautious when certain topics emerged. He noticed the minister long before the minister noticed him. Not because the minister stood out, but because everything around him was unnaturally smooth. No friction. No resistance. Systems that should have slowed instead accelerated. Questions that should have been raised never were. That kind of smoothness is never accidental. The file that would eventually matter did not announce itself. It was not hidden in a vault or protected by encryption. It survived because no one thought it mattered anymore. A duplicated record. A partial attachment. A document categorized incorrectly years ago during a restructuring no one remembered clearly. Its importance had been buried under irrelevance. Until a review process began. Routine, on paper. A standard administrative audit triggered by procedural updates. Hundreds of documents passed through automated filters. Most were cleared instantly. A few were flagged for manual review. Among them was the file. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply existed. Traoré did not rush to retrieve it. He understood that discovery without context was useless. What mattered was the moment when relevance could no longer be denied. He allowed the process to unfold naturally, resisting the temptation to intervene. Patience was not passive. It was strategic restraint. Inside the minister's office, the first signal arrived disguised as bureaucracy. A request for clarification. A reference number that should not have been active anymore. A name associated with a project officially concluded years earlier. The minister dismissed it initially. Systems generated noise all the time. Junior analysts misunderstood context. Old records resurfaced without consequence. He had seen this before. Still, something about the request unsettled him. That evening, he reviewed the document himself for the first time in years. The language felt unfamiliar, as if written by someone else. The signatures were real. The structure was intact. Too intact. He reassured himself that it proved nothing on its own. Without the full chain, it was meaningless. But sleep came slowly that night. Over the following days, small disruptions accumulated. Meetings ended without resolution. A partner requested additional documentation that had never been required before. An aide hesitated before answering a simple question. These were not threats. They were signals. The minister responded the way powerful men often do when certainty begins to erode, by asserting control. He reminded staff of protocols. He emphasized hierarchy. He expected reassurance. What he received instead was caution. Traoré remained silent. He did not contact the minister. He did not leak information. He did not apply pressure. He understood that the most effective force at this stage was uncertainty. The minister had lived too long believing the past was sealed. Introducing doubt was enough to destabilize the foundation. Inside the minister's circle, conversations changed tone. People spoke carefully, avoiding specifics. Loyalty shifted from confidence to self-preservation. Trust, once assumed, now required confirmation. The minister noticed, and for the first time, he could not identify the source of the tension. That disturbed him more than open opposition ever could. Power is trained to confront resistance, not ambiguity. Meanwhile, the file moved quietly upward through the system. Not exposed. Not interpreted. Simply acknowledged as unresolved. Its presence alone altered behavior. People began asking questions they had never thought to ask. And questions, once asked, cannot be unasked. Traoré reviewed developments without satisfaction or urgency. He knew the story was not yet ready to surface. Exposure too early would reduce it to noise. What he wanted was inevitability. By the end of the week, the minister understood one thing clearly. Something had resurfaced. He did not know what. He did not know who. He did not know how far it had traveled. But for the first time in years, he understood that the ground beneath his authority was no longer solid. And somewhere beyond his reach, beyond his influence, a truth he believed permanently buried was quietly waiting to be seen. The first mistake powerful people make is assuming danger announces itself. The minister had survived scandals before. He had watched accusations rise, peak, and disappear. Time had always been his ally. Institutions had always absorbed the shock. He believed this moment would be no different. Whatever had resurfaced, it would be managed, redirected, neutralized. That belief began to decay quietly. The file did not explode into public view. It did not appear on screens or circulate through rumors. Instead, it settled into the system like a splinter beneath the skin, small enough to ignore, painful enough to feel. Each time the minister tried to focus on daily operations, it returned to his thoughts. A reference number. An outdated signature. A project name that should no longer exist. He requested internal reviews under the pretense of routine diligence. Departments responded politely but slowly. Answers arrived incomplete. Clarifications raised new questions. For the first time in years, the minister encountered resistance without defiance. That unsettled him. Inside his inner circle, confidence thinned further. People who once spoke freely now measured their words. Advisors avoided making definitive statements. No one wanted to be wrong. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who defended the wrong position when history shifted. Fear had changed direction. The minister sensed it and responded instinctively. He increased his presence. He demanded briefings. He inserted himself into processes he had delegated long ago. This was not strength. It was exposure. Power, when forced to prove itself, begins to reveal its limits. Ibrahim Traoré watched without interruption. He understood that the most effective pressure was indirect. Letting the system react to itself created fractures no single confrontation ever could. The file, still unopened by the public, was already reshaping behavior. People adjusted priorities. Caution replaced certainty. And caution breeds mistakes. A mid-level official requested historical context during a meeting not meant to address the past. A legal advisor asked whether previous approvals had been revalidated under updated regulations. These were not accusations. They were procedural inquiries. But they forced the minister to respond. Each response added weight to the record. Each explanation created a version of events that could later be tested against facts. The minister, accustomed to final authority, now found himself explaining decisions made years ago to people who no longer accepted, "because I said so," as sufficient justification. At night, he reviewed old notes, trying to reconstruct a timeline he had intentionally forgotten. The more he remembered, the more he realized how many people had once known pieces of the truth. Some had retired. Some had disappeared into private sectors. Some, he suspected, might be watching quietly. Trust became a calculation. Traoré remained absent from the center of tension, but his influence began to surface subtly. Not through orders, but through alignment. Departments that rarely coordinated now shared information. Reviews expanded their scope. Oversight mechanisms activated clauses that had long been ignored. Everything was legal. Everything was procedural. Everything was unavoidable. The minister considered intervention. A call to a foreign partner. A reminder of mutual interests. A quiet request to slow the process. But hesitation stopped him. Any move now risked confirmation that there was something worth hiding. And hesitation, once introduced, weakens authority. The file was finally opened. Not dramatically, but carefully. Analysts examined it line by line. On its own, it still proved little. But it connected dots. It referenced transfers that led elsewhere. It hinted at agreements mirrored in other documents. It was no longer alone. Traoré authorized nothing publicly. He allowed others to reach conclusions independently. That was the brilliance of the strategy. Truth discovered voluntarily carries more weight than truth imposed. As findings accumulated, a quiet consensus formed. Something had been misrepresented. Something significant. Not enough to accuse, but enough to escalate. The file moved upward again, this time accompanied by context. The minister was informed late. He read the summary twice before understanding the implication. This was no longer a technical inquiry. It was a structural threat. His instinct was to deny, but denial required certainty he no longer possessed. The narrative was forming without him. He realized then that power was slipping not because he had been exposed, but because he was no longer controlling the story. Publicly, nothing had changed. Cameras still framed him as composed. Statements remained measured. But behind the facade, alliances weakened. People began planning for outcomes they had never considered before. And the minister felt something unfamiliar. Isolation. Traoré observed the shift with restraint. He did not celebrate. He did not rush to finalize anything. He knew the most dangerous moment was approaching, not for him, but for the minister. The moment when fear would override discipline. That moment came sooner than expected. In a closed meeting, the minister pushed too hard. He demanded assurances no one could give. His tone sharpened. His authority, once assumed, now had to be asserted. The room responded with silence. Silence is never neutral. After that meeting, communication slowed dramatically. Decisions were deferred. Emails went unanswered. The system, sensing instability, began protecting itself. Traoré made his first visible move, not against the minister, but for the process. He emphasized procedure, transparency, accountability. No names were mentioned. No accusations made. But everyone understood the direction. By then, the file had done its work. The minister understood something critical. Even if the truth never reached the public, his control had already been compromised. Power, once questioned internally, never fully recovers. He considered resignation. Then dismissed the thought. That would be an admission. He considered confrontation. That would confirm suspicion. There were no good options left. As the second week ended, the system prepared for the next phase. Not exposure yet. Validation. Corroboration. The kind that cannot be undone. Traoré reviewed the trajectory and remained calm. He had not sought this outcome for personal gain. For him, leadership was not about humiliation. It was about restoring boundaries power had forgotten. The minister, alone in his office late at night, finally acknowledged what he had refused to accept. The secret was no longer buried. It was waiting. Power does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes. By the time the minister realized what was happening, the process had already moved beyond him. Decisions were being made in rooms he was no longer invited into. Conversations were happening without his approval. His authority still existed on paper, but paper no longer controlled reality. The file was no longer just a document. It had become a reference point. Analysts cross-checked it against financial records once considered irrelevant. Legal advisors revisited approvals that had never been questioned. Patterns emerged slowly, methodically, without drama. Every new connection reduced the minister's room to maneuver. What made the situation irreversible was not the content itself. It was consistency. The story held. Traoré understood that this was the moment where many leaders fail. They rush. They speak too soon. They allow emotion to contaminate clarity. He did none of that. He allowed the system to complete its work, knowing that conclusions reached independently are the hardest to challenge. Behind closed doors, the minister attempted what little influence he had left. Calls were made. Old alliances were tested. Responses came carefully worded, non-committal, distant. No one wanted to be seen intervening now. Support had not vanished. It had evaporated. The minister prepared a defense he would never formally present. Explanations layered with technical language. Justifications framed as misunderstandings. He rehearsed them alone, knowing there would be no audience sympathetic enough to listen. For the first time, fear was no longer abstract. It was logistical. Traoré's role became visible not through accusation, but through order. He authorized an independent review. Transparent. Procedural. Impossible to dismiss as political theater. The announcement was brief. No names mentioned. No conclusions drawn. Yet everyone understood what it meant. The review confirmed what had already become obvious. The file was not an anomaly. It was an anchor. Everything connected to it sank under scrutiny. What once appeared fragmented now formed a complete narrative. The minister was informed of the findings privately. There was no confrontation. No raised voices. Just facts. He listened in silence as each point was explained. As timelines aligned. As inconsistencies were named. His objections were noted and set aside. Not dismissed, evaluated. And found insufficient. That was the moment he understood the difference between power and authority. Power can delay consequences. Authority enforces them. Publicly, the transition was subtle. A statement about accountability. A temporary reassignment, pending clarification. Language designed to preserve institutional stability. The minister's name was not immediately removed from anything. But everyone knew. Media coverage followed cautiously. Analysts avoided speculation. Commentators focused on process rather than personalities. The lack of sensationalism made the story stronger. This was not scandal. It was correction. Traoré addressed the situation only once. His words were calm, measured, almost restrained. He spoke about responsibility. About systems correcting themselves. About leadership requiring restraint rather than dominance. He did not mention the minister. He did not need to. The minister watched the address from his office, now nearly empty. His staff had been reassigned. His schedule erased. His influence reduced to memory. The building that once amplified his authority now reflected his isolation. There was no arrest. No spectacle. Just removal. In the weeks that followed, additional reviews surfaced. Secondary actors distanced themselves. Some resigned quietly. Others faded into obscurity. The system adjusted, absorbing the shock without collapsing. That was the true victory. Not humiliation. Not revenge. Stability. Traoré understood that exposing power was meaningless if it left chaos behind. What mattered was what replaced it. Stronger boundaries. Clearer oversight. A reminder that silence protects corruption only until patience runs out. The minister issued a final statement days later. Carefully worded. Regret without admission. Responsibility without clarity. It satisfied no one and offended no one. It was irrelevant. History had already moved past him. Inside institutions, a lesson settled deeply. Not spoken aloud, but understood. No position is untouchable. No secret is permanent. No authority exists without accountability. Traoré returned to his work without ceremony. There were no celebrations. No declarations of victory. He knew the cycle would repeat elsewhere, someday. Power always tests limits. It always assumes permanence. And somewhere, another file would be waiting. The difference was that now, people remembered. They remembered that power does not fall loudly. It does not announce its collapse. It does not beg for attention. It collapses in silence. When the truth appears,